Antifa, the emphasis is on the first syllable, and it's pronounced more on than and, so Antifa, it's commonly mispronounced. But Antifa, of course, is short for anti-fascist. And, you know, President Trump's comments that the quote-unquote alt-left and alt-right are equivalent moral forces is really historically misinformed and morally bankrupt. The anti-fascist movement has a global history that stretches back over about a century. You can trace them to Italian opposition to Mussolini's black shirts, German opposition to Hitler's brown shirts, anti-fascists from around the world who traveled to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. More recently, modern Antifa can largely trace its roots to the anti-fascist movement in Britain in the 70s and the post-war period more generally that was responding to a xenophobic backlash against predominantly Caribbean and South Asian migration, also to the German autonomous movement of the 80s, which really after the fall of the Berlin Wall had to respond to really unprecedented neo-Nazi wave, unprecedented in the post-war period, of course. And then in the United States, we can look at anti-racist action in the 1980s, 1990s, and the early 2000s, which took some of these methods of confronting neo-Nazis and fascists wherever they assemble, shutting down their organizing, and as they said, going where they go. Today, in an article I wrote for the Washington Post called "Who Are the Antifa?" I explain this and show how today's Antifa in the United States are really picking up the tradition where these groups left off, and their movement has really accelerated with the unfortunate ascendance of the alt-right following President Trump. The other minor note I want to make before we continue is that Antifa is really only one faction of a larger movement against white supremacy that dates back centuries and includes a whole number of, there are a whole number of groups that fight against similar foes, sometimes using the same methods that aren't necessarily anti-fascist. So it's important not to subsume the entire anti-racist movement within this sort of one category.
In your book, and I want to quote a few lines from it, you say, most people have an all-or-nothing understanding of fascism that prevents them from taking fascists seriously until they seize power. Very few really believe that there is any serious chance of a fascistic regime ever materializing in America. And wondering about that and the importance of understanding that concept of yours for those who are looking at what's happening today in America.
Right. So the way people understand fascism or the way they've been taught about it is generally exclusively in terms of regimes. So the thought goes, as long as we have parliamentary government, we're safe. But we can look back to the historical examples of Italy and Germany and see that unfortunately, parliamentary government was insufficient to prevent the rise of fascism and Nazism, and actually provided a red carpet to their advance. So because of that reason, people think of fascism in terms of all or nothing, regime or nothing. But we can see in Charlottesville that any amount of neo-Nazi organizing, any amount of fascist presence is potentially fatal. And unfortunately, Heather Heyer paid the price for that. So that's partly why anti-fascists argue that fascism must be nipped in the bud from the beginning, that any kind of organizing needs to be confronted and responded to, even if you know, people are spending most of their time on Twitter making jokes. It's still very serious and needs to be confronted.
Against the white supremacists. There were flags of Republicans in Spain fighting Franco.
Right. So one of the most iconic moments in anti-fascist history is the Spanish Civil War, and from an international perspective, the role of the international brigades, brave anti-fascists who came from dozens of countries around the world to stand up to Franco's forces. Franco had the institutional support of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, whereas the Republican side really only had support of the Soviet Union, which, as I discuss in my book, had a lot of problematic aspects to it. So if we look at the role of the international brigades, we can see that anti-fascists view their struggle as transnational and transhistorical. And so today, if you go to an anti-fascist demonstration in Spain, for example, the flag of the international brigades, the flag of the Spanish Republic is ubiquitous, and these symbols, even the double flags of anti-fascism that people will frequently see at demonstrations, often one being red, one being black, was originally developed as a German symbol, which in its earliest incarnation dates back to the 1930s. So it's important to look at Antifa not just as sort of a random thought experiment that some crazy kids came up with to respond to the far right, but rather a tradition that dates back a century. So part of what I try to do with my book, Antifa, is draw certain historical lessons from the early period of anti-fascist struggle that can be applied to the struggle today. One of them is that it doesn't take a lot of organized fascists to sometimes develop a really powerful movement. We can see that recently with the rise of Golden Dawn, the fascist party in Greece, which prior to the financial crisis was really a tiny micro-party and considered a joke by most. Subsequently, they became a major party in Greek politics and a major threat, a violent, deadly threat to migrants and leftists and people of all stripes across Greek society. This was also true back in the early part of the 20th century when Mussolini's initial fascist nucleus was 100 people. When Hitler first attended his first meeting of the German Workers' Party, which he later transformed into the Nazi Party, they had 54 members. So we need to see that there's always a potential for small movements to become large. And one of the other lessons of the beginning of the 20th century is that people did not take fascism and Nazism seriously until it was too late. That mistake will never be made again by anti-fascists who will recognize that any manifestation of these politics is dangerous and needs to be confronted as if it could be the nucleus of some sort of deadly movement or regime of the future. Right. Well, the other side of it is it's not just about how many people are part of fascist or neo-Nazi groups. It's also about the fact that far-right politics have the ability to infiltrate and influence and direct mainstream politics. And we can see that with the alt-right. The alt-right is not really actually a lot of people in terms of numbers, but they've had a disproportionate influence on the Trump administration and certain aspects of public discourse. So the presence of Bannon and Gorka and Miller in the White House really just gives some sort of a hint as to why it is that Trump yesterday basically said there are good people on both sides of this conflict, that Friday night when there were neo-Nazis wielding torches in Nazi style and they attacked nonviolent UVA student protesters, that he said, oh, well, you know, these are good people. So part of it is the organized street presence. But as we saw, by confronting the organized street presence in Charlottesville, this created the question of just how bad these people are. Because you played earlier, Mitt Romney condemned the fact that there could be blame ascribed to both sides. Well, prior to Charlottesville, that was the dominant media narrative. Most mainstream media was saying, oh, well, we have quote-unquote violence on both sides. Hands up, who's to say who's right or wrong? But by confronting this, by putting it in the spotlight, by shining a light on what these people really think, it's shifted the public discourse and pushed back the ability of some of these alt-right figures to try and cloak their fascism.
This is to those who maybe are opposed to the viewpoints of the white nationalists and white supremacists, but also attempt to condemn any attempts to shut them down or not allow them to speak. And obviously, the American Civil Liberties Union fought for the right of the Charlottesville, the white nationalists to have their rally in Charlottesville.
Right. Well, the question of how to combat fascism, I think, always needs to come back to discussions of the 1930s and 1940s. So clearly we can see that rational discourse and debate was insufficient. Clearly we can see that the mechanisms of parliamentary government were insufficient. We need to be able to come up with a way to say, how can we make sure never again? By any means necessary, this can never happen again. And the people back there who witnessed these atrocities committed themselves to that. So the question is, okay, if you don't think that it's appropriate to physically confront and to stand in front of neo-Nazis who are trying to organize for another genocide now, do you do it after someone has died, as they just did? Do you do it after a dozen people have died? Do you do it once they're at the footsteps of power? At what point do you say enough is enough and give up on the liberal notion that what we need to do is essentially create some sort of a regime of rights that allow neo-Nazis and their victims to coexist, quote-unquote, peacefully, and recognize that the neo-Nazis don't want that, and that also the anti-fascists are right in not looking at it through that liberal lens, but rather seeing fascism not as an opinion that needs to be responded to respectfully, but as an enemy to humanity that needs to be stopped by any means necessary. Right, so Antifa is a pan-left politics of social revolution applied to fighting the far right. It believes in using direct action rather than turning to the state or the police to stop the fascist advance. and it includes anarchists, communists, socialists across the political spectrum, and really dates back decades. They're people who are really not going to allow fascists and Nazis any room to organize. One of their main kind of slogans is no platform for fascism.
Overall, far-right extremist plots have been far more deadly than far-left plots. In the past 25 years, according to a breakdown of 2 terrorism databases by an analyst at the libertarian Cato Institute, white nationalists, militia movements, anti-Muslim attackers, IRS building, and abortion clinic bombers and other right-wing groups were responsible for 12 times as many fatalities and 36 times as many injuries as communists, socialists, animal rights and environmental activists, anti-white and Black Lives Matter-inspired attackers, and other left-wing groups, the Times wrote. Mark Bray.
Yes, well, it's certainly true that in terms of body counts, in terms of raw violence, the far right now and in the past has much more blood on their hands. But I also want to encourage viewers to think not only in terms of numbers of comparing body counts, not only in terms of violence in the abstract, but the values and context of violence. So, you know, when anti-racists defend themselves violently, it's different from when racists attack people of color, queer and trans people with violence. So it's certainly true that the far right are much more violent, but I don't think that we can exclusively think of it in terms of numbers. The other thing that I want to encourage viewers to think about is that the term terrorism usually is used in a way that essentially legitimizes state violence and police violence. Historically, the greatest sources of violence have come from states and have come from their armies and police, but is not labeled terrorism. So I think instead of thinking in terms of this sort of seemingly neutral concepts of terrorism or violence or body counts, let's also think in terms of politics and context.
Comments came after the deputy assistant to the president, Sebastian Gorka, suggested on MSNBC that the Minnesota mosque bombing was a false flag attack.
There's a great rule. All initial reports are false. You have to check them. You have to find out who the perpetrators are. We've had a series of crimes committed, alleged hate crimes by right-wing individuals in the last 6 months that turned out to actually have been propagated by the left. So let's wait and see. Let's allow the local authorities to provide their assessment, and then the White House will make its comments.
So that's Sebastian Gorka, one of the advisors to President Trump. Talk about who he is.
Right. So Sebastian Gorka is one of Trump's advisors and has documented links to far-right white supremacist factions. And really this comment shows how the Trump administration cannot accept the fact that what they refer to as terrorism is a predominantly a white nationalist threat in this country, and they cannot accept the fact that their attempts to simply shine that lens onto the groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda and therefore implicate Muslim and immigrant communities is actually, even by their own standards, misguided in terms of the raw amount of damage and destruction caused through these kinds of unwarranted attacks. So that's another reason why anti-fascists focus on confronting the far right to cut them off from their abilities to access these kinds of high ranks of power.
President Gorka has been facing calls for his resignation after the Jewish-American newspaper The Forward reported that Gorka is a sworn member of a Hungarian far-right Nazi-allied group. The Forward reported that members of the Vitezi Rend have confirmed Gorka took a lifelong oath of loyalty to their group, which the U.S. State Department says was under the direction of the Nazi government of Germany during World War II. If the report is true, it means Gorka may have lied on his U.S. immigration application, which requires people to disclose ties to such organizations. He's denied reports of his involvement with Nazi-allied group, telling Tablet magazine, "I have never been a member of the Vitez Rend." If you could talk about the significance of this, Mark Bray.
Right. Well, it shows that just like Bannon's connections to Breitbart, Gorka really, his values don't even reflect those of the Republican Party, not that those are values that I stand up for. So we need to be really vigilant about the fact that Trump is a racist, that Trump is not so casually supporting white nationalist principles in politics, and that he's, if this is what he says in public, imagine what he's saying in private. So certainly calls for him to get rid of Gorka and get rid of Bannon and so forth are really important. We need to also push to get rid of Trump and then keep pushing and really create a broad anti-racist movement that can deal with whoever comes next.
Can you talk about those who criticize Antifa for, or some members in it, for violence? Your response to that?
Right. Well, the question of violence needs to be situated historically. So in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, part of the problem is that across the political spectrum, many people did not take this threat seriously until it was too late. By not confronting them with their fists, they ended up having to confront them with tanks. And so today, anti-fascists have drawn the historical lesson that because neo-Nazis and fascists are violent, because they have a documented tendency, not only in the past but today, of attacking left events. For example, I spoke to an immigrant rights activist in Stockholm, Sweden, who said that there had to be anti-fascists at their immigrant rights demonstrations to be ready for the frequent situation where neo-Nazis would show up with knives and broken bottles to attack them. So the other thing is, when we talk about violence and anti-fascism, we need to be aware that historically and today, it has to be situated within self-defense. Self-defense understand in an immediate sense and in a preemptive sense that's historically informed and recognizes that if we don't stop them now, we may not be able to stop them later. That's really the question that anyone who is opposed to Antifa self-defense needs to be able to answer, is when is enough enough, and when is it legitimate to stand up to these people by any means that are necessary based on the circumstance. Right. Redneck Revolt is a network of groups all around the country. I think now they have close to 30 chapters around the country that essentially tries to target the fact that much of the white working class that attend gun shows and that live especially in rural parts of this country have been won over to the right. So by showing up to gun shows, by promoting anti-racist propaganda, and also by pushing back against liberal opposition to bearing arms, they've managed to really build bridges with a lot of working-class white people, bring them over to their side, and create essentially armed self-defense units around the country. For example, we've seen in Arizona and elsewhere, they've showed up with the Brown Berets and other groups bearing arms at far-right, alt-right demonstrations. So it's really an attempt to sort of create a gun culture of self-defense on the far left, and also create points of interaction with segments of the population, with working-class white people who all too often feel alienated by what they perceive to be sort of a liberal disdain for them.
Something fundamentally authoritarian about its claim that its activists, who no one elected, can decide whose views are too odious to be publicly expressed. That kind of undemocratic, illegitimate power corrupts. It leads to what happened this April in Portland, Oregon, where Antifa activists threatened to disrupt the city's Rose Festival parade if people wearing red MAGA hats, you know, the Make America Great Again hats, marched alongside the local Republican Party. Because of Antifa, Republican officials in Portland claim they can't even conduct voter registration in the city without being physically threatened or harassed. So yes, Antifa is not a figment of the conservative imagination. It's a moral problem that liberals need to confront. That's Peter Beinart writing for The Atlantic. Mark Bray.
Right. So part of the accusation that's frequently leveled against Antifa is the slippery slope argument, understood abstractly. So the argument goes, Antifa get to sort of randomly decide who they don't like and shut them down, therefore authoritarianism. But the historical record shows that Antifa groups focus on the far right, focus on neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and when those groups are successfully disrupted, there's a long track record of Antifa groups essentially disassembling and focusing on other issues. The notion that it's authoritarian to shut down authoritarianism would not feel very comfortable if we're thinking about, for example, opposition to Nazis before they got into power in Germany in the late 20s. Were the communists and anarchists who were defending themselves against Nazis in 1929 authoritarian because they wanted to stop Nazism? That sounds ridiculous, right? So once again, as we discussed in the first part of the interview, it's an example of a kind of all-or-nothing fascism where, in the absence of an immediate threat of a fascist regime, shutting down someone's opinions And of course, that's how far-right politics are often understood, as opinions that could just as easily be interchanged with any others when anti-fascists start to know platform, which misses, of course, the politics behind it, that these opinions are the lens that is examined at out of context, out of political focus. So you know, it really is missing the point historically and analytically, and really missing the ways that a lot of alt-right people are infiltrating the Republican Party. The Republican Party is now, to some extent, starting to stand up to the far right, but needs to do a lot more. And we need to recognize that the far right will try to hide behind the legitimacy that Trump has given their politics, but that anti-fascists aren't willing to stop it. And you know, if Beinart saw, for example, you know, Nazis in the 1920s or 1930s marching along a mainstream parade with swastikas, would it have been inappropriate, considering that the Nazi Party back then was a mainstream party, to have tried to disrupt that? You know, those are the kinds of comparisons that need to be made in discussing this question.
He's certainly energized the white supremacist Klan, white nationalist movement. But when it comes to Antifa.
Right. So as we know, the term Antifa is new to mainstream American discourse. It really came into the public view around when anti-fascists disrupted Milo Yiannopoulos at UC Berkeley back in early February. But prior to that, especially between maybe the mid-2000s and maybe around 2015, the role of anti-racist, anti-fascist organizing along this model hit sort of a little bit of a historical lull in the United States. I spoke to a number of anti-fascists in my book from around the country who said that, you know, in the late 2000s, the notion of putting one's time into tracking the far right was seen as a bit of a waste of time, a bit of missing the mark, that these Klansmen or whatever are you know, insignificant. But with the rise of Trump, we've seen the potential power they have not only to take life in an immediate sense, as tragically happened in Charlottesville, but also to influence a wider public discourse. So a lot of American leftists are really trying to come up with a framework, come up with a strategy, come up with a set of tactics to be able to respond to this in a way that's effective and in a way that is adequate self-defense. And the Antifa model has come to the fore, and a lot of people are trying to understand what that is, what it's meant, and how it's done in other countries, such as Europe and Latin America, where it has a lot longer trajectory.
You know, what about this issue of free speech and white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan, neo-fascists?
Right. So the question is, what is the relationship between neo-Nazis and their victims? What is the relationship between fascists and the rest of society? Is the goal to create a set of abstract rights that allow them to coexist, or is the goal to struggle against them and prevent them from being able to organize? That's a fundamental question. It's a political question that divides civil libertarians from many leftists and anti-fascists. The anti-fascist argument is, if you allow neo-Nazis the ability to organize, the ability to mobilize, they become normalized. They attempt to become family-friendly. We can see back a number of months ago, I believe it was in May or April, in Pikeville, Kentucky, the fascist Traditionalist Workers' Party attempted to hold a white pride family picnic because of opposition that wasn't able to happen. But let's imagine if on a regular basis we don't confront them, we don't shut them down, they start to organize family-friendly picnics. White nationalism becomes another opinion worthy of granting certain legal protections. Where can that lead us? It can lead us, as we've seen through historical examples, to somewhere that's very dark. So the question is, from the anti-fascist perspective, a political struggle, not a sort of economy of rights. And that's where the two political tendencies diverge. To me, after the horrors of slavery, after the horrors of the Holocaust, we need to prioritize defending the vulnerable, and we need to essentially say that fascism and Nazism are not simply ideas to respect, they are enemies to confront and to rid from history.
To make myself more capable of violence, I'm here to spread ideas, talk, in the hopes that somebody more capable will come along and do that. Somebody like Donald Trump, who does not give his daughter to a Jew. I don't think that you could feel about race the way I do and watch that Kushner bastard walk around with that beautiful girl.
That's a piece from Vice interviewing white supremacists in Charlottesville. Mark Bray, your response on this joining together of the racist, anti-Semitic white supremacists.
This is who they are. This is who they've always been. we need to recognize that if they get their way, they are going to create a white ethno-state and exterminate a lot of people. Donald Trump tries to hide behind the fact that he has a son-in-law who's Jewish, he has grandchildren who are Jewish, but clearly he's not perturbed enough by anti-Semitism to take a firm line against these people. It's truly baffling, and it's really sad that we haven't moved beyond these hateful ideas. To try to take an optimistic tone, however, it is very encouraging to see Black Lives Matter, anti-fascists, people working for queer and trans liberation, people working for immigrants' rights, standing together shoulder to shoulder to confront this menace and say that we just simply will not tolerate this kind of threat from growing.
Why handbook?
Well, I don't think that scholars and writers can stand on the sidelines when it comes to fascism and Nazism. There is nothing good to be said of them, and they need to be opposed. I didn't want to simply write a history that would give people a sense of what happened. I wanted to bring the voices of anti-fascists who have been confronting these heinous ideologies, these heinous groups for decades. I wanted to bring their perspectives, their experiences, their outlooks, their successes and failures to readers in a way that encourages them to learn from them and apply some of these lessons to their own struggles against their local neo-Nazis or fascists. The book includes anecdotes, stories, discussions of strategy, nonviolence, free speech, and I hope that it can be useful. I hope it can be practical, and also 50% of authors' proceeds are being donated to the International Anti-Fascist Defense Fund. So in every way I could, I hope that this would be a useful tool, not only an abstract historical read.